Tanzania, Dr. Michael Anthony Beto. Dr. Beto, you're welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here with you.
We appreciate your presence, and we thank you for choosing to visit TBC.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Dr. Michael Anthony Beto is a distinguished career, has had a distinguished career of public service spanning 4 decades. And he's been a senior advisor to the Bureau of African Affairs of the U.S., Department of State for the USA Africa Summit, Leaders Summit in 2014. He was U.S. representative to UN Economic Commission for Africa and USA ambassador to the AU in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He served 20 years as a chaplain in the USA Army Reserve, and he's been senior academic administrator at Chicago State University, of course, and other universities. And in 1994, he actually was in South Africa as election observer. So he has had experience in Africa. That's a brief, actually, introduction of His Excellency the Ambassador. And I would like to start our conversation by looking back at, in 1963, our first president, Julius Kambarage Nyerere, visited the U.S. It was July,
yes.
And he was received by John F. Kennedy. And many people have said they had this, friendship, which if Kennedy had lived, we don't know where the relationship would have ended between our two countries. But that is to show that our close ties started way back. Right. We opened diplomatic relations in 1961, and ever since we've continued that way. What memories do you have of the relations between Tanzania and USA, starting from then?
Yeah. You know, I was 13 years old in July of 1963.
Right.
And through my high school and college days, I was in college from 69 to 73. As a young African-American, deeply involved in the protests for civil rights and human rights, Julius Nyerere was one of the primary motivators that said to young African-Americans that freedom is not only possible, but freedom can result in leadership and development and growth. And it's an interesting circle because Kenyatta, Nyerere, and Nkrumah inspired the civil rights movement with Martin King and Jesse Jackson and Andrew Young and Ralph Abernathy. And then those same leaders in the U.S. civil rights movement inspired Nelson Mandela and the freedom in South Africa. And that's why I often say to people that it is incorrect to look at Julius Nyerere as only an icon in Tanzania. He's an icon for the world. Wherever people long to be free and who believe in self-determination, the ability to control one's own destiny, Nyerere is one of the primary inspirers and inspiration sources. So we owe a debt of gratitude to Nyerere, just as Tanzanians owe a debt of gratitude to him. And I often say to my Tanzanian friends, you have to share him with the world, because that was his message and that was his mission. It was freedom and liberation for the world. And Tanzania just happened to be the principal part that stimulated his growth toward liberation. But he was liberation conscious globally. So I owe an inspiration to Nyerere, just as you owe an inspiration to Nyerere. And because of that, I think we are all responsible to continue a strong relationship between Tanzania and the United States. It makes us perfect partners. We all have a sense that territorial sovereignty is important. The determination of one's own destiny is important. The ability to live in a diverse country, the way Tanzania is and the way the U.S. is. But Tanzania has managed to live in a diverse country without the internal strife that often happens in other parts of the world. So that notion of unity and diversity I think you've done a better job than most other people around the world. And so we look up to Tanzania for the great job you've done in demonstrating what unity and diversity looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Ms. Ambassador, one of your, strong credentials is the fact that you have dealt with issues to do with Africa,
yes.
and you have also lived in Africa,
yes.
and therefore you understand Africa. Here, when we talk about the relationship between, or the relations between the U.S. and Tanzania, we can see it vividly through the following programs. For example, under George W. Bush, we had Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. Under President Barack Obama, we had Power Africa, which continues to date. And under Donald Trump, we had Prosper Africa. How would you contextualize, these relations through these programs today?
For a long time, U.S. relationship with Africa has been a relationship of donor and a relationship of giving aid. We are still the largest private donor to Tanzania in terms of the amounts of money we spend on health care and on development. And we think that's continually important, because when you're developing the lives of people and making sure that people can live healthy and have freedom from disease like COVID-19 and the rest, that's important. But there is also a shift that you begin to see very intentionally with President Obama, where President Obama said that our relationship with Africa must be one of strategic partnership, where there is mutual growth and development, mutual exchange. So then the notion of trade and investment began to be more prominent. Prosper Africa was a part of that notion that in order for Africa to take off with its own industrial revolution, it had to have the electrical grid to make it possible. Because you cannot develop as a nation if only the large cities have electrical grids. You have to have electrical grids throughout the whole country in order to increase the amount of day hours that a person can work, increase the amount of hours that a student can study. So what the Biden administration has done is it is returning to that notion that trade and investment is the hallmark. I was very pleased when I met with President Samia, and I mentioned to her that my primary focus while I'm here is going to be trade and investment. And she said to me sternly and yet affectionately that it's about time, that because Africa has been waiting and Tanzania has been waiting for us to do more trade and investment. And we're very intentional about that, in part because we know, it's not just we think, we know that no government, not the U.S. government, the Tanzanian government, no government can hire all of its educated people. There just are not enough jobs in the government, and no government has enough money to do that. So private investment, which creates industry and corporate leadership, creates jobs. It creates value-added productivity on the African continent, where the wonderful natural resources that God has blessed this continent with, through industrial development, those natural resources then can get converted to value-added products, which then Tanzania can sell to the rest of the world. So we are consciously shifting. Trade and investment is the future of our relationship with Tanzania and with the whole of the African continent.
Yeah, in the same context, Mr. Ambassador, I remember the 2022 USA Africa Leaders Summit. The USA pledged $55 billion, the highest amount ever, and actually much higher than any other country in that context. And this happens in the context of what you just said, that in the previous relations, there was this feeling that Western countries in general were patronizing and condescending,
right.
and giving directives what should be done, what should not be done. How do you assess this new change of approach, and what do you think the difference will be?
Well, the difference again grows out of the notion established by Obama and carried on consciously, very intentionally by President Biden. The relationship has to be strategic. Mm-hmm. And for it to be strategic, there has to be long-term planning that takes place with joint plans with Africa and with the U.S. So you notice that under Obama and now intentionally again under Biden, we have embraced Africa 2063. Because Africa 2063 is the mandate of the African continent itself.
Yeah, by African Union.
African Union. Yeah. I was at the African Union in 2013 when 2063 was developed as the 50-year projection from 2013, looking back 50 years and then projecting forward for 50 years. So the notion of Africa 2063 is a unified, prosperous, and peaceful continent where travel and trade happens seamlessly, where people can move from country to country seamlessly, where a company, whether it's Western, whether it's an Asian company, no matter what it is, can do business in Tanzania without having to worry about a separate set of laws and regulations in Kenya and Uganda and Burundi and Rwanda, and now as the DRC becomes a part of the EAC, and as South Sudan becomes a part of the EAC. The unity of the EAC as a REC becomes the foundation for how we will do business with all of the EAC, which we think lifts Tanzania, and it lifts all of Tanzania's partners, and it makes it a much larger scope. In the U.S., for example, if you look at the city of Atlanta, Georgia, well, Atlanta, Georgia has about 500,000 people, but the standard metropolitan area, which is the geographical center in which Atlanta is located, is multiple millions of people with phenomenal diversity in terms of business operations and the capacity to do trade, the capacity to invite investment. So if Tanzania looked at itself exclusively with 60-some million people, wonderful market. But when Tanzania is a part of the whole EAC, hundreds of millions of people. That's a much bigger market. And so when corporations can do business with all of that market simultaneously, it becomes more advantageous for every part of the partnership.
Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, let's stick to that point. Okay. I remember in 2000, I think it was under which president, there was this AGOA opportunity.
Yeah,
was it under Clinton?
Yeah. Clinton.
Yes. There was this AGOA opportunity for Africa, right. Which was, and many people say, was part of the shift or change in approach. Right. But there are observers who think Africa did not utilize that opportunity effectively. What is your take on that? Well, and probably what could we do better?
Okay. Well,
yes.
Clinton was the first U.S. president to invite African leadership from the foreign ministers level to the U.S. Then Obama did it with the presidents, and then Biden did it with the presidents. One of the things about AGOA, and AGOA has been tremendously profitable, but AGOA was conceived bilaterally, where a relationship with Tanzania was a relationship with Tanzania. So when AGOA was in the process of being reaffirmed, a recommitment to AGOA started exploring what would be the possibilities if there could be regional dimensions and not just exclusive bilateral dimensions, which then was a natural segue into the notion that if you're going to really do regional dimensions, it has to be beyond AGOA. It has to be private-public partnerships where corporate needs are met and corporate resources can come to bear to increase the expansion of investment opportunity. So then the investment model now is larger than single isolated products that Tanzania can produce and then sell to the U.S. That's really what AGOA did. It provided an opportunity for Tanzania to sell things more easily in the Western market. Exceptional, but beyond the ability to sell to the American market, it's getting American investment into capacity building in the Tanzanian market, where Tanzania not only sells to the West, it sells to the rest of East Africa, which sells to the rest of the African continent. Because one of these days, and I hope it's in our lifetime, the world will recognize that Africa has the resources, it has the people, it has the capacity to be a leader on the global stage. And that leadership on the global stage only happens when Africa achieves its 2063 goals. A unified, the European Union, for example, was developed in part because Europe had to find a way to stop interfighting. The African Union was not developed exclusively to end African fighting. It was developed with the intent of unifying a continent for the benefit of development, trade, and growth. So for a long time, Africa has talked about being peaceful, being prosperous, being productive. Now is the moment in history that it is our obligation to make sure that that dream is realized. And I'm going to do everything I can with every breath I have to try to help that capacity building with the African continent.
And Mr. Ambassador, on that same note, it is a good thing. I know the U.S. foreign policy, one of the areas where you support is actually regional integration.
Yes.
And Africa has been making some giant steps towards that. And right now, East African community includes members such as South Sudan.
Absolutely.
And recently DRC. But talking about DRC, this is a country, a rich country, that has not seen real peace in the last 60 years of independence. And currently there are over 130-something rebel groups actually fighting. Making it some parts of the country, I think, should be taken to deal with that situation once and for all, so that we may reap the benefits you just described of a bigger East African market.
Addressing the issues in DRC will absolutely require Rwanda, Uganda, DRC, and the rest of the EAC focusing on the fact that fragility in the DRC is a loss to the EAC and a loss to the African continent. It is a very rich country, it's a very diverse country, but for whatever reasons, and I'm sure there are a lot of geopolitical reasons, the notion of one people inhabiting a unified context of diversity, as in Tanzania, that philosophical notion has not permeated. So what Tanzania can do as a part of receiving DRC into the EAC is continue to model that you can have a nation diverse with multiple tribal contexts, multiple nationalities, and multiple languages. But the people have to desire to live as one. And Tanzania is a model for that. And when Rwanda and Uganda and other countries in the EAC can recognize that what the DRC has to offer with its cobalt and with its other resources can lift all of the EAC, but it has to be prosperous first. So the question, like the chicken and the egg notion is, what comes first? Peace or prosperity? And I've always said it's not a dichotomy. You have to work on peace and prosperity simultaneously because each feeds the other. A peaceful context has the space to become prosperous. And a prosperous context will demand that it is peaceful. And so what we do is we try to support regional efforts to address some of the fragility of the DRC. We support UN efforts to address the fragility of the DRC. But until the DRC...
But Mr. Ambassador, sorry to interrupt.
Sure, go ahead.
When you look at the UN, for example, it's a respectable organization, a global organization, but historically, when you look at the role of the UN in DRC, you see that it hasn't helped much.
Well, you know what? The UN has a posture of non-interference. It has to be invited. The African Union has a posture of non-indifference. Now, two words, but it's a philosophical difference. The African Union's non-indifference policy says that you are obligated to engage when fertility and non-constitutional governments are being formed or when a government is about to fall apart. The United Nations posture is you must be invited to do so. So the United Nations is constrained by its own philosophical direction, where the African Union is more free to engage. So what the UN has been trying to do, and some of its partners have been trying to do, is support the effort to build the capacity of the African Union to implement its non-indifference policy while we're still constrained in the UN by non-interference.
Right.
When I was at the AU, that was one of the biggest battles that I had, and I would try consciously and successfully to get the UN Security Council participants to meet with the African Union Peace and Security Council to talk about how there can be a hybrid notion where non-interference would be maintained by the UN and non-indifference would be maintained by the African Union. But the African Union could not implement non-indifference without capacity building. And the UN cannot be faithful to non-interference without being invited. So it's one of those vicious circles.
Exactly, yeah. Now, talking about insecurity in Eastern DRC, Tanzania is a country that was once affected by terror attacks. You know, the twin terror attacks in Dar es Salaam, and there was the other one in Nairobi. And it has turned out that in recent years, there are times when the U.S. Embassy here, and of course elsewhere in Africa, would actually issue advisory or alerts. And today you have a world of social media, and these alerts will just go on social media, and it will probably create pandemonium in public. And some observers think, why shouldn't the U.S. Embassy communicate to relevant authorities who would know how to report if there are any threats to security in the country?
Now, when the U.S. issues any alert, we have already checked with the relevant authorities in the country. We've already validated our data with their data. You know, when you do serious research, you triangulate data before you can determine whether or not something is in fact the case. We always triangulate our data. We have never issued any advisory on single source data that is exclusively our data without triangulating the data.
Mr. Ambassador, actually the issue, where the issue is in reporting the issue. That shouldn't the hosting government, the government of this country, be responsible for announcing any threats, because they would know how to to give people confidence that, you know, something is being done.
Well, you know, there are two areas of responsibility. One area of responsibility that any embassy has is to make sure that its subjects are safe and peaceful.
Exactly.
And also to make sure that the host country is safe and peaceful. Now, just go back for a second. We coordinate not only in terms of validating the data, but we also talk directly with the host government before we issue any alert. Now, the comment that I made to Foreign Minister Tax is that in the future, I will make sure that I communicate at my level directly with the foreign minister, and not only with communication through certain levels of bureaucracy.
Right.
Because the reality is that you can communicate a set of data directly to agencies. You have no control of how that data then goes up the line. So the point that we will improve on is having at my level, while we're doing all of the other coordination, and we did coordinate and we did communicate, we communicated well. What I will do moving forward is make sure that I communicate also directly with the foreign minister for collaboration purposes, and to move forward from there.
Right, thank you. I think that's a very fair answer. You talked about President Samia Suluhu Hassan. She's the first female president of this country who took over presidency after a tragedy. But she has actually demonstrated a lot of abilities in putting the country together and, bringing in some new direction, bringing Tanzania closer to international community and all that. And we remember in May 2022, she visited the US to launch the Royal Tour film, and thereby, by extension, to attract investors and tourists to this country. And I'm sure it was reported about USD 5 billion deals were made during her visit. How would you describe her leadership?
Okay. Yeah. Now, what I liked about her leadership is this. Her first tour to the U.S. was not focused government to government.
Private sector.
It was on private sector investment, which is something that African leaders tend not to do. It's a government to government kind of interaction. What President Samia was doing was establishing that Tanzania is a global player on the international stage. And she also did something that was quite unusual. She visited African countries to talk about intercontinental trade and investment, Africa with Africa. Brilliant.
Yeah.
When she went to the African Union most recently, she met with Libya to talk about the need for the appearance of discord between the African Union and Libya to be settled. She met with Prime Minister Abiy about the conditions in Ethiopia. She has proven herself to be a person who sees a vision for Tanzania, not just as a strong nation, but as a regional partner and as a global partner. And most recently, when she announced that there is a need for reconciliation, where opposition groups can be free to talk and to try to persuade voters to their position, and where she embraced the notion that the Tanzanian family of people is a diverse family of people. It's going to have diverse opinions, but at the end of the day, Tanzania has to be a unified people. So from that vantage point, I'm the U.S. ambassador. I have tremendous admiration for the direction of democracy that is not emerging as if it's the first time. It is re-emerging in a significant way in Tanzania. And President Samia is ushering in that re-emergence with finesse and with absolute brilliance. It's just not finesse. It's brilliance and finesse.
Absolutely. And my next question, actually, we're moving towards the end of our interview. My next question was supposed to address this very notion of democracy. Democracy, when you look at countries like the US, you've had over 200 years of democracy. And our country's democracy is still nascent. It definitely has to go through ups and downs. But in Tanzania, we've had a culture of actually coming together often when we have a squabble, we've had quarrel, we have had misunderstandings, we would at the end of the day come together by ourselves, by the way,
yes,
and then address the challenges. It has happened in Zanzibar, where they have a government of national unity, and there's a lot of progress taking place there. Just like what you described here in Tanzania mainland. What would be your advice to Tanzania when it comes to democracy? Because you've gone over 200 years, you know it better. The times you've gone up, times you've gone down. Share with us your experience, please. Yes.
Democracy is a continued process.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody ever arrives at perfect democracy. It is always in process.
Yeah.
That's why in the U.S. we have this saying that we are striving to make it a more perfect union.
Right.
And so it is the process, I think, that is most important. And what Tanzania is doing, it is proving that it is in the process of developing more open freedom, more direct engagement by people. It's a process. In your process, however, you have managed to deal with diversity a lot better than the West has learned to deal with diversity. So while we are helping Tanzania build capacity, we're also hopefully learning from Tanzania that you can have diverse people. You can have people from multiple languages, from multiple orientations, from multiple perspectives, from multiple religions, but who on purpose decide we are going to be brothers and sisters because that's the way we ought to be.
Right.
The U.S. can learn from that. And just as Tanzania can learn from elements that we have, we also learn from Tanzania. So democracy is a continued process. It is always in process. It will never, ever be perfectly achieved.
Right. So in the time that you are going to be here on your tour of duty, after you are through with your tour of duty, what do you think or what do you envisage to see in Tanzania and also in Africa generally in the context of what we have discussed? Trade, investment.
Greater trade and investment, greater movement consciously and intentionally toward opening democratic space, much more free travel, and association among people from different parts of the world. The tourism in Tanzania, I hope to be far more robust, with Americans coming here regularly and in droves to benefit from the beauty that Tanzania has to offer. And that when we come here and participate in tourism, that we also bring our corporate executives to see opportunities. Opportunities, however, not to take away Tanzania's resources, but to help Tanzania develop its own resources to produce value-added productivity. That's what I want to see, and that's what I will work toward every single day when I get up on Blessed to Be on Tanzanian soil. It's going to be how can we best improve the relationship between the U.S. and Tanzania with greater investment. We're going to do the development thing. We're going to always do that because there will always be a need. But simultaneously, we will be very conscious about the trade and investment angle.
Right. So I give you the opportunity, if you have something you'd like to say that you haven't said in this program as we move to a closing end.
Thank you, Tanzania, for what you teach the world. Thank you for the legacy of Julius Nyerere. Thank you for the direction of a unified people living together intentionally in harmony. We want to be your partner. We want to be a strategic partner, a long-term partner. We want to trade and we want to have investment here in Tanzania that creates wealth in Tanzania. Ambassador
Dr. Mike Anthony Beto, thank you very much.
Thank you. My absolute pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, viewers, we have come to the end of this special program where we had the U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania, Dr. Michael Anthony Beto, and we have discussed issues, various issues on the relations between the U.S. and Tanzania. Thank you for watching, and please continue to watch the oncoming programs.